Welcome to Hollywood Shadows, the podcast that explores the darker, more fascinating corners of cinema history. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into the life of a man who literally transformed himself into nightmares, monsters, and outcasts. Yet behind those grotesque masks lived one of the most compassionate souls Hollywood has ever known. Picture this. It's 1925, and you're sitting in a darkened movie theater. The organ music swells as a figure emerges from the shadows on screen. Your breath catches. The face before you is so twisted, so horrifying, that children in the audience scream and adults gasp audibly. But this isn't just movie magic. This is pain. Real physical agony transformed into art. The man behind that face? Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. And today we're gonna peel back those famous masks to discover the extraordinary human being who lived beneath them. To understand Lon Chaney, we have to start with silence. Not the silence of the movies he later starred in, but the profound, life-shaping silence of his childhood home in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Born Leonidas Frank Chaney on April 1st, 1883, Lon entered a world where words held little power. His parents, Frank and Emma Chaney, were both deaf. His father was a barber who had lost his hearing in childhood, and his mother was born without the ability to hear or speak. Now, imagine being a hearing child in this environment. While other kids learn to express themselves through tantrums and tears, through pleading and arguing, Lon learned something far more profound. He learned to communicate with his entire body. Every gesture had to carry meaning. Every facial expression needed to tell a complete story. Young Lon didn't just learn sign language. He became fluent in the language of the body itself. He could convey joy, sorrow, anger, and love without uttering a single word. He was, without knowing it, preparing for a career that hadn't even been invented yet. But here's what makes this story so beautifully human. Lon never saw his parents' deafness as a disability. To him, they were the most expressive people in the world. His mother, Emma, could tell entire stories with just a look, could show love with a simple touch of her hand to his face, could express disappointment with the slightest change in her posture. Years later, when Lon became famous for his incredible facial expressions and body language, reporters would ask him about his technique. He would simply say, "I learned it from my parents. They taught me that you don't need words to speak to someone's heart." At school, Lon was often the interpreter between his parents and his teachers. This wasn't always easy. Picture a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing between two worlds, trying to translate not just words, but emotions, concerns, hopes. He became a bridge between the hearing and deaf communities, learning early that communication was about so much more than sound. This responsibility aged him quickly. While other children played games, Lon was learning to read people's faces like books, to understand the subtle differences between a worried frown and an angry scowl, between genuine laughter and polite chuckling. And perhaps most importantly, he learned empathy, real, deep empathy for people who were different, who were misunderstood, who lived on the margins of society. This wasn't just sympathy. It was understanding born from lived experience. Is it any wonder that years later, Lon Chaney would become famous for playing outcasts, monsters, and the understood? he wasn't just acting. He was drawing from a well of understanding that had been filling since childhood. Like many actors of his generation, Lon's first taste of performing came not from the movies, but from the rough and tumble world of vaudeville and traveling theater companies. In 1902, at just 19 years old, Lon married Cleva Creighton, who sang in local opera houses. Here was a young man who had grown up in silence, falling in love with a woman whose life was built around sound. Her voice, her music, her songs. It's almost poetic in its irony. Together, they joined traveling theater troupes, moving from town to town across the American West. These weren't glamorous productions. These were small-time operations that set up in mining towns, farming communities, anywhere they could find an audience and make a few dollars. Lon did everything. He acted, he sang, he danced, he even did comedy. But more importantly, he watched. He studied every performer, every audience reaction, every moment that the crowd was captivated or bored. He was building a mental library of human emotion and expression. Their son, Creighton, who would later become famous as actor Lon Chaney Jr., was born in 1906. For a brief moment, it seemed like Lon might have the stable family life that had anchored his own childhood. But life, as it often does, had other plans. In 1913, Cleva attempted suicide by drinking mercuric chloride during a performance at the Majestic Theater in Los Angeles. The incident was public, traumatic, and devastating. Though she survived, her voice was permanently damaged. And the woman who had lived for music could barely speak above a whisper. The scandal rocked their marriage. Divorce followed, and Cleva left, unable to bear the constant reminder of what she had lost. Lon was left to raise young Creighton alone, a single father in 1913, when such things were almost unheard of. But here's where we see the real Lon Chaney emerge. Rather than becoming bitter or broken, he threw himself into work with even more determination. He had a son to support, dreams to chase, and he'd learned from his parents that adversity was just another form of communication. It was life telling you to find another way to express yourself. He began taking any job he could find in the growing film industry. Bit parts, background roles, anything that paid. And slowly, very slowly, people began to notice something special about this quiet man with the expressive face. The early days of cinema were like the Wild West. No rules, no established techniques, just people figuring it out as they went along. And in this chaotic, creative environment, Lon Chaney began to find his voice. His first major breakthrough came in 1919 with a film called The Miracle Man. In it, Chaney played a fake cripple who pretends to be healed by a phony evangelist. The role required him to contort his body in ways that seemed impossible, twisting his legs, hunching his back, creating the illusion of severe disability. But here's what made Chaney's performance extraordinary. It wasn't just about the physical transformation. He understood that the character's deformity wasn't his defining feature. The man's humanity was. Fan the soul beneath the twisted exterior, and audiences were mesmerized. The success of The Miracle Man changed everything. Suddenly, Lon Chaney wasn't just another actor. He was the go-to man for characters that other actors wouldn't or couldn't play. The outcasts, the deformed, the monsters that lived in society's shadows. And Chaney embraced this role with a dedication that bordered on obsession. For the Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, he created a hump that weighed over 40 pounds. He strapped it to his back with a harness that cut into his shoulders and made breathing difficult. The makeup alone took hours to apply, and once it was on, he was virtually unrecognizable. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional commitment. He didn't just play Quasimodo, he became him. He found the loneliness, the yearning for acceptance, the deep capacity for love that lived within the monster's heart. Here's a story that perfectly captures Chaney's approach. During filming, a young actress was frightened by his appearance as Quasimodo. Instead of breaking character or making light of the situation, Chaney gently approached her, still in full makeup and costume, and began to speak softly about the weather, about her family, about anything that would help her see the man beneath the monster. By the end of their conversation, she wasn't afraid anymore. She later said, "He showed me that monsters aren't born. They're made by how people treat them." Success in Hollywood often comes with a price. And for Lon Chaney, that price was measured in physical pain. His most famous role, Eric, in The Phantom of the Opera, nearly killed him. The makeup process was brutal. To create the Phantom's skull-like appearance, Chaney used wire loops to pull back his nostrils, painted his face with grease paint and shadows, and wore a wig that pulled his skin tight. But the real agony came from what he did to his eyes. To create that haunting, hollow look, Chaney would pull down his lower eyelids and hold them in place with thin wires. The pain was excruciating, and after long days of filming, his eyes would be red-shot and swollen. Yet Chaney never complained. When asked about the discomfort, he would simply say, "The audience doesn't want to see Lon Chaney. They want to see the Phantom. My job is to disappear." And disappear he did. So completely that when the famous unmasking scene was filmed, the moment when the Phantom's true face is revealed, audiences in theaters would scream, faint, and sometimes flee from their seats. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Chaney's transformations wasn't the makeup or the costumes. It was his ability to find the humanity in every character, no matter how monstrous they appeared. Take his portrayal of the Phantom. Yes, Eric is a killer, a madman who terrorizes the Paris Opera. But in Chaney's hands, he becomes something more complex. A man driven to extremes by loneliness, by society's rejection, by the simple human need to be loved and accepted. When Eric finally reveals his face to Christine, Chaney doesn't play it as pure horror. There's vulnerability there, fear, even hope. Will she see past the deformity to the man beneath? The moment is terrifying, yes, but it's also heartbreaking. This is where Chaney's childhood with his deaf parents becomes crucial to understanding his art. He had learned early that people who were different weren't necessarily dangerous, they were just misunderstood. Every monster he played carried this understanding, this deep empathy for the outsider. While the world knew Lon Chaney as the master of horror, the man himself was remarkably different from his on-screen personas. Colleagues described him as quiet, thoughtful, and incredibly generous. He was a perfectionist, yes, but not in a demanding, tyrannical way. Instead, he was hardest on himself. He would spend hours perfecting a walk, a gesture, the way a character held his shoulders. Every detail mattered because every detail was part of the story he was trying to tell.
Director Todd Browning, who worked with Chaney on several films, once said, "Lon had this incredible ability to find the core of truth in any character. It didn't matter if the man was a murderer or a saint. Lon could find what made him human." And Chaney's humanity extended far beyond his performances. Despite his fame and success, he never forgot where he came from. He regularly sent money to his parents in Colorado, ensuring they were comfortable in their old age. He was also incredibly devoted to his son Creighton. Despite the demands of his career, Chaney made sure to be present for the important moments in his boy's life. He attended school plays, helped with homework, and taught his son the same lessons about empathy and understanding that he had learned from his own parents. In 1926, Chaney remarried, this time to Hazel Hastings, a former chorus girl who became his closest companion and creative partner. The Miraculous was his masterpiece. With Hazel, Lon found the stability and understanding he had been seeking. What drove Lon Chaney to endure such physical pain for his art? Why did he choose to play characters that other actors avoided? The answer lies in something Chaney once said in a rare interview. "Between pictures, there is no Lon Chaney. I become the character I'm playing. That character becomes real to me, more real than my own life sometimes. And if that character is in pain, then I must be in pain too. Otherwise, how can I truly understand him?" This wasn't method acting in the modern sense. This was something deeper. Chaney believed that to truly portray someone, you had to live in their skin, literally and figuratively. You had to understand not just how they looked, but how that appearance affected the way they moved through the world. For West of Zanzibar, he played a man whose legs were paralyzed. Chaney bound his legs so tightly that circulation was cut off, causing genuine numbness and pain. When he moved using only his arms, the struggle was real, the effort authentic. Critics sometimes accuse Chaney of being a mere showman, someone who relied on makeup and tricks rather than true acting ability. They couldn't have been more wrong. The makeup and physical transformations were just the beginning. The real artistry lay in how Chaney found the emotional truth within each character. He understood that physical deformity or difference was often just the external manifestation of internal pain, pain that came from being rejected, misunderstood, or feared by society. In many ways, Chaney was ahead of his time in how he portrayed disability and difference. Rather than playing his characters as objects of pity or fear, he showed them as complete human beings, with hopes, dreams, desires, and the same capacity for love and hate as anyone else. His Quasimodo wasn't just a monster. He was a man who loved beauty, who yearned for acceptance, who was capable of both great tenderness and terrible rage. His phantom wasn't just a killer. He was an artist whose genius had been twisted by society's cruelty. By the late 1920s, Lon Chaney stood at the pinnacle of his career. He was one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood, known worldwide as the master of horror and characterization. Studios competed for his services, and audiences flocked to see what new transformation he would unveil. But beneath the success, cracks were beginning to show. The years of physical abuse, the tight bindings, the painful makeup, the contorted postures, had taken their toll on Chaney's body. He suffered from chronic back pain, his joints ached constantly, and he had developed a persistent cough that he couldn't shake. More troubling was the approach of a new era in Hollywood, talking pictures. The talkies were revolutionizing the film industry, and many silent film stars found their careers end overnight. For Chaney, this presented a unique challenge. His entire career had been built on visual storytelling, on the ability to convey complex emotions without words. How would his monstrous characters translate to sound films? The irony is almost too perfect. The man who had learned his craft from deaf parents, who had mastered the art of silent expression, was being asked to find his voice just as his physical voice was beginning to fail him. Chaney did make one talkie, The Unholy Three in 1930, a remake of one of his earlier silent successes. In it, he played 5 different characters, each with a distinct voice and manner of speaking. Even in his debut as a talking actor, Chaney was transforming, disappearing into multiple personas. The film was a success, proving that Chaney could adapt to the new medium, but it would also be his last completed film. In early 1930, Lon Chaney began experiencing severe throat pain. Initially, he attributed it to the stress of adapting to talking pictures, perhaps vocal strain from his recent film work. But the pain persisted, and eventually medical examination revealed the devastating truth. Chaney had developed throat cancer, likely caused by years of breathing the toxic chemicals used in his elaborate makeup applications. The diagnosis was a death sentence. In 1930, medical science had no effective treatment for advanced throat cancer. There is a tragic poetry to this final twist. The man who had learned to communicate without words, who had made silence into an art form, was being returned to silence, but this time not by choice. As his condition worsened, Chaney became increasingly reclusive. The man who had spent his career transforming into others found himself trapped in a body that was failing him. The final transformation was one he couldn't control, couldn't perfect, couldn't turn into art. Yet even in his final months, Chaney continued to demonstrate the character that had defined his life. He refused to see most visitors, not out of vanity, but because he didn't want to be remembered as weak or diminished. He wanted his legacy to be the characters he had created, not the man who was dying. On August 26, 1930, at the age of 47, Lon Chaney died at his home in Los Angeles. His last words, spoken to his wife Hazel, were reportedly, "Don't let them make me into a monster after I'm gone." In death, Lon Chaney achieved something that had eluded him in life. He became himself. No more masks, no more transformations, no more pain. Just the memory of an artist who had given everything to his craft. The objectories praised his technical skill, his dedication, his unique place in film history. But they missed something crucial. They missed the heart of what made Chaney special. Lon Chaney wasn't just a master of makeup and physical transformation. He was a translator of human experience. He took the pain of being different, of being rejected, of being misunderstood, and he made it visible. He gave faces and voices to society's outcasts. In an era when people with disabilities were often hidden away, when difference was feared and misunderstood, Chaney forced audiences to look, to see, to feel empathy for those they might otherwise avoid. His influence on cinema was immediate and lasting. Directors like Todd Browning continued to explore themes of difference and acceptance. Actors like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi followed in his footsteps, though none quite achieved the same level of empathetic portrayal. But perhaps Chaney's greatest legacy lies not in the films he made, but in the lesson he taught, that monsters are not born. They are created by society's cruelty and fear. Every time we see a film that asks us to empathize with the villain, every time a story reveals the humanity behind a monstrous exterior, we're seeing Lon Chaney's influence. He taught cinema that the most frightening monsters are often the most human, and the most human characters are often the most frightening. So who was Lon Chaney, really? Behind all those faces, beneath all those transformations, what kind of man lived, breathed, and loved? He was a man shaped by silence, who learned to make noise without sound. He was a father who balanced an impossible career with genuine love for his son. He was an artist who never forgot that technique serves emotion, not the other way around. Most of all, he was someone who understood that being different isn't a curse, it's just another way of being human. His parents had taught him this lesson in the quiet house of his Colorado childhood, and he spent his career teaching it to the world. Think about it. In an industry built on beauty and glamour, Chaney chose to specialize in ugliness and deformity. But through his art, he revealed that there's beauty in ugliness, grace in awkwardness, love in loneliness. The 1,000 faces of Lon Chaney were really just facets of one face, the face of humanity in all its pain and glory, its isolation and connection, its fear and courage. When children screamed at his phantom, they weren't just reacting to his appearance. They were confronting their own fears about being different, being rejected, being unloved. When adults wept at his Quasimodo, they weren't just crying for a fictional character. They were mourning every time they had been cruel to someone who was different. As we reach the end of our journey into the life of Lon Chaney, I want to leave you with this thought. We all wear faces. We all transform ourselves daily to meet the world's expectations. But Lon Chaney's gift was showing us that it's okay to be different, okay to be strange, okay to be the monster in someone else's story. Because monsters, as he taught us, are just misunderstood humans wearing their pain on the outside. The next time you see someone who looks different, acts different, or lives differently than you do, remember Lon Chaney. Remember that behind every face, beautiful or grotesque, familiar or strange, lives a human being with the same needs for love, acceptance, and understanding that we all share. In learning to speak without words, Lon Chaney taught us the most important language of all, the language of empathy. And in a world that often seems divided by our differences, that might be the most valuable lesson any artist has ever given us. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Lon Chaney's remarkable life. Until next time, this has been Hollywood Shadows. Remember, we're all just faces in the crowd, but every face tells a story worth hearing.